Marvel and DC Comics are both billion-dollar corporations with dozens of movie universes and hundreds of comic titles that have lasted decades. From Batman to Spider-Man, Zatanna to Punisher, both companies seem to have it all when it comes to superheroes. With all of these titles that get published, there are sure to be some that slip under the cracks. I'm sure we all remember when we first got into comics and realized there are so many characters who we've never even heard of. Oftentimes, we forget how little the average person knows about comics. Even characters like Nightwing, who is seemingly unanimously well known and loved, I doubt most people's moms could name them. Now, obviously I'm not saying Nightwing is obscure, but there are many characters who are. Many, some of even the most devoted comic fans haven't heard of. Today I want to focus on these characters, the ones who faded into obscurity and the average person knows little to nothing about. Come with me as I dive into the most obscure comic book titles. Y'all knew I had to talk about them. The Doom Patrol first appeared in My Greatest Adventure issue 80 in 1963. Created by Arnold Drake and Bruno Premiani, My Greatest Adventure was an anthology run, with each issue containing a self-encapsulated story. Issue 80 sold ridiculously well, and before long, the run was converted to focus solely on the team, and the title was renamed to Doom Patrol with issue 86. The team consisted of 4 members, the first being Cliff Steele or Robot Man. Cliff was a man who lost everything but his brain in a race car driving accident. Niles Calder was able to input his brain into a mechanical body, allowing him to live as a robot. Then there's Larry Trainor, an Air Force pilot who encountered a mysterious energy field while on a mission. This energy attached itself to his body as a parasitic being known as the Negative Spirit. Larry reinvented his life as the Negative Man, now being able to control his spirit and fight villains. Next there's Rita Farr, or Elastigirl. Rita was a Hollywood actress who inhaled toxic volcanic fumes while shooting a film in Africa. These fumes gave her the ability to enlarge and shrink her body at will. Finally, there's Niles. The gentle-hearted and kind-natured leader of the team is a wheelchair-bound old man who commands the team remotely. If you're familiar with the show, you may find my way of describing Niles strange, but he wasn't evil in Drake's original run. The run was very ahead of its time, with the reading experience resembling that of 80s comics much more than it did those of the era. The team was known for being weird, with characters often calling them freaks and denouncing their existence. Nevertheless, Rita, Larry, Niles, and Cliff persisted until the team was killed off in issue 121 due to dwindling sales, and they weren't seen again until the late 80s. Paul Kupperberg revived the team with his run in 1987, following Niles' long-lost wife showing up on a quest to track down her dead husband, who she assumed faked his death. This team had an all-new cast, with some familiar faces showing back up as well. I wasn't a huge fan of it personally, and neither were many of the fans when the run was cancelled due to dwindling sales in 1989 and passed off to a new writer. Following the success of Animal Man in 1988, Grant Morrison was chosen as the writer to continue Paul Kupperberg's Doom Patrol run. Morrison brought a wide array of concepts to the team, most of them sticking for a long time and becoming staples of the Doom Patrol. Their run was incredibly surreal, with the first arc showing the team travel to an alternate dimension full of evil men with giant scissors trying to evade reality, ultimately realizing the entire reason they exist is because some guy got really high and just willed them into existence. Unsurprisingly, Morrison's run was booted to DC Vertigo due to his absurdist and surrealist storytelling and themes, but this didn't stop its success. This run is known as being the most influential, being the main inspiration for why Gerard Way started writing comics and eventually being adapted into a live-action Doom Patrol show. Eventually, Morrison got bored and passed the torch to another writer. Rachel Pollack was responsible for the next run, following the end of Morrison's and taking the team into a vastly different direction. The team until this point clearly had themes of being an outcast, often being compared to the X-Men for their similarities. Morrison's run even had a non-binary character, Rebus, who is the GOAT, but Pollack used these outcast themes to tell a story about her struggles with her own identity. You see, Pollack herself is transgender, and in her run she introduces Kate Godwin, or Coagula. Coagula is a trans woman and is one of the main 3 characters of the run, the other 2 being Robot Man and Dorothy Spinner. The run mainly focuses on themes of feminine identity and her personal battles with gender identity. Dorothy is a young girl who has always been bullied for her appearance, and now undergoing puberty, is struggling with what it means to be a woman. Robot Man is a man who had everything taken from him, struggling to adapt to his new life after toxic masculinity and misogyny have been instilled on him his entire life. He lost everything, and now he struggles with what it means to even be a man in the first place. Coagula acts as a guiding hand for these two, shedding a more nuanced side of femininity as someone who experienced it as both a man and a woman. The way the run showcases struggling with your identity is done beautifully, and Rachel Pollack's Doom Patrol stands as my personal favorite comic book run of all time. If you're a Doom Patrol fan and you haven't checked this one out, or if you're not, and you still think it sounds good, I'd always recommend it. It's an incredible read, and has such an incredibly nuanced outlook on both queer and feminine identities alike. The rest of the team's history is pretty rocky, going through many retcons and continuity shifts, not to mention how the Flashpoint and Rebirth events completely threw a wrench in everything. Many of these runs are also not super notable, apart from two. Gerard Way's Doom Patrol was a love letter to Morrison's, rehashing a lot of the ideas from it while introducing new concepts in the same vein. Way's run is honestly pretty divisive, with longtime fans thinking it's a cheap ripoff of Morrison's, and newer fans like me loving it all the same. Way brought Morrison's run back to the main continuity, and Dennis Culver continued it from this point with his run, Unstoppable Doom Patrol. Culver's run was a short miniseries, but it kept consistent with the Doom Patrol vibe and also crossed over with many other superheroes like Green Lantern and Batman, which is something very uncommon in the team's history. The run continued with the theme of being outcasts and freaks, this time working its way into the main plot. The story focuses on the team recruiting new members and growing immensely in numbers, almost being an academy for young metahumans. Where Teen Titans Academy failed, this run succeeded. The team always felt like a net that caught every friend and foe who slipped through the cracks of the DC universe, consisting of the leftovers and rejects from other superhero teams. The team taking time to train and teach young metahumans who have nowhere else to turn is a very fitting theme for the team and works well in this run. Overall, the Doom Patrol has had a very rocky history with multiple retcons and timeline changes, but they are very near and dear to my heart and I love them all the same. Their obscurity in large part comes down to the vast disconnect from them to the rest of the DC universe. Western comics vastly differ from other forms of media in the sense that they're mostly dominated by two shared universes, DC and Marvel. Most people read DC and Marvel for Batman and Spider-Man respectively. The Doom Patrol has had very little overlap with other superheroes. The team's most notable runs, like Morrison's and Pollack's, weren't even in the same universe. And when the team does cross over with other heroes, the difference between them is oftentimes jarring. Doom Patrol comics often focus on vastly different subject matter than other DC titles, which leads to there being a clear gap in the universes between the two. Recently, DC has embraced the surreality of the team, and undid the retcons, but the team's history still remains, and causes most to forget the team ever exists. Another reason is sales. While DC does have Vertigo and Black Label to give writers more freedom, these runs typically sell much less than Batman and Superman for obvious reasons. Due to this, DC is less likely to invest in keeping these runs going. This has led to there being much less Doom Patrol runs than the rest of DC titles. DC also doesn't really care about the team as much because they're not one of the heavy hitters. In other words, Doom Patrol comics often get the short end of the stick. Despite all this, the Doom Patrol still has a very dedicated cult following, me included. This is because the stories often appeal to a small selected few. Their stories are usually allegorical for discrimination based on identity, oftentimes focusing on queer struggles and gender identity. The inspiration from the Surrealism and Dadaism art movements and many runs often turns off casual audience as well, with many claiming the stories are confusing and hard to follow, and even pretentious. Differently from many other superhero comics, the stories aren't typically focused on fighting villains and saving the day, but more so the characters' personal struggles. Many villains represent the characters' problems, even sometimes being physical manifestations of them. All of this combined doesn't really work well in the team's benefit, and all of these problems have caused the team to fall into obscurity time and time again over the years. There have been things like the show, and their additions in Young Justice, Teen Titans, and Batman Brave and the Bold, which all work to introduce the team to new audiences. Nowadays, most have heard of the Doom Patrol, but haven't read much, if any, of their comics. However, despite their obscurity, they're an incredible team of superheroes and deserve much, much, much more recognition than they get, just like our next hero on the list.
I wouldn't exactly call Booster Gold obscure in how I would define the word. I feel like especially after this popularity boom that he had last year at this point, he is pretty well known among comic book fans. But I do think that a lot of people miss out on his first solo. I feel like most people just kind of know of him and don't actually look into him. Or worse, read what Tom King wrote. But I feel like Booster Gold's first solo is just such a perfect way to have introduced this character. His first appearance isn't in somebody else's book, it is here in Booster Gold issue 1. And how he came to be is actually really interesting. So Dan Jurgens was relatively new to comics. He, I think, had been doing some work for DC for maybe 5 years now. He had written a few comics and he had drawn some, but he hadn't really had many big jobs. He was not one of a big name. Crisis on Infinite Earths happened and DC needed some new titles. So Dan Jurgens pitched Booster Gold. This comic is such a perfect way to introduce Booster. In this first page, we don't even see him. And then when we do see him, he's at a gym negotiating a movie deal. And he wants $5 million and he wants to play himself. And that is such a perfect way to introduce this character. You learn so much about Booster and nothing is really explicitly stated. You don't even learn about his backstory until issue 6. And I think that's so perfect, especially for this character, because for those first few issues, you are seeing Booster Gold as a normal citizen of Metropolis would see him. You see this like arrogant, sort of greedy guy, and you just have to love him. He has so many of these like little quirks. He gets idioms wrong very often, especially in this first issue. The art in this is also phenomenal. I especially like this page. I think Dan Jurgens is so phenomenal at art. His art, especially in this, is so expressive. Dan Jurgens is definitely my favorite comic artist. You also get introduced to Booster's supporting cast of Dirk Davis and Trixie Collins. Trixie is definitely one of my favorite characters in this series. Yeah, you should read Booster Gold. It's a very good comic.
Man-Thing first appeared in May of 1971 in Savage Tales issue 1. Created by Stan Lee, Man-Thing was a scientist who was transformed into a plant-like humanoid entity and now resides in the Florida Everglades as a protector of the nexus of all realities. His first appearance sold well, which led to his subsequent appearance in the 1973 Adventure into Fear run before he eventually got his own solo series in 1974. The series did well enough to keep it going, but was eventually cancelled in 1975 due to dwindling sales. It's impossible to discuss why Man-Thing is so unpopular without discussing his direct competitor, DC's Swamp Thing. You most likely heard of this guy. Arguably the most famous horror-themed superhero in the world, close friend of Constantine and Zatanna, and longtime member of the Justice League Dark. He's kind of a big deal. Swamp Thing first appeared in July of 1971, just 2 months after Man-Thing's first appearance. Despite their names, they're even similar in concept, both having been turned into a swamp monster after an accident in a marsh, now hell-bent on protecting the very wilderness that transformed them. They also both first appeared in an anthology story before eventually getting their own runs, which lasted pretty similarly in length. All of this to say, they're both incredibly similar characters, so why did one do much better than the other in sales and overall cultural impact? Quality. The answer's quality. Unlike others on the list, the consensus of why Man-Thing is so obscure comes down to its quality. The 1974 Swamp Thing run blew its competitor out of the water in almost every way. Both focused on themes of gothic horror, but Swamp Thing delved much more into themes of identity and existential horror, while the 1972 Man-Thing run overall lacked the same quality of storytelling, which led to Swamp Thing having the advantage in both sales and critical success. However, a little over a decade later, one run would release which solidified Swamp Thing as the critical success he's seen as today. Alan Moore's Swamp Thing. You knew I was going to mention it. Considered one of the greatest comic runs of all time, and one I personally haven't read but have heard so much about, this run introduced a core element to the character. It introduced the idea that Swamp Thing didn't actually undergo a transformation, but died the night of his accident. The plant monster he is now absorbed Alec Hanlon's consciousness and memories. He never was a human, just a plant pretending to be one. Up until this run, he didn't even know this fact. He just assumed he underwent a transformation into this monster, as did everyone else. But he's quite literally just a plant monster that absorbed the memories of a man, now believing himself to be one. Introducing this incredibly horrifying concept makes the character's stories even scarier. The idea brings up questions like, what are we other than our consciousness? If we can't trust our own memories and sentience, then what the hell can we trust? Again, I haven't read this run, but I've heard that the handling of this terrifyingly existential concept is done so well, and I would 100% recommend it just based on its impact alone. Alan Moore's Swamp Thing was met with critical success, and most forgot who Man-Thing even was, being completely outshined by his competitor. Nowadays, Man-Thing is rarely brought up. He'll occasionally get runs or appear in other comics as a cameo, but these comics never sell very well, making Marvel rarely do them. While it may be sad that Man-Thing was forgotten at the time, at least we got to see the success of one swamp monster in pop culture. While most prefer him to his counterpart, Man-Thing's obscurity is mostly due to his commercial failure and lesser quality of his stories. It's rare we see a direct counterpart amongst DC and Marvel, but in cases like this, usually one comes out on top. Do you prefer Swamp Thing or Man-Thing? Either way, it's clear which one has solidified himself in our current pop culture lens. And with that, the video is over. All things considered, these heroes aren't super obscure. Sure, they're not Batman and Superman, but they're still more well known culturally than, let's say, Challengers of the Unknown. please do not make me read Challengers of the Unknown, for the love of God. Their stories are so boring. Anyway, if you have any recommendations for other comic titles, please comment those below. I definitely want to make this video concept into a series because it seems super fun and I'd love to explore more unknown comic titles. Thank you all for watching, and I will see y'all later.